My phone buzzed at exactly 7:20 that Tuesday morning, and by 7:21, my stepson had already decided what my place in the family was worth. Nothing. My dad passed away last night, Eric said flatly. Linda sat across from me at our kitchen table, still in her blue robe, spreading orange marmalade on a piece of wheat toast. Outside, a garbage truck groaned its way down our street in Columbus. It should have been an ordinary morning. Then Eric added, his lawyer already called. You're not getting a dime. I heard Rachel, my daughter-in-law, laugh beside him. Finally, she said, you're out. I didn't argue. I simply tapped speaker and set the phone between the sugar bowl and Linda's coffee mug. My wife took one last sip, placed the mug down carefully, and leaned toward the phone. Eric, she said, don't celebrate until Mr. Brooks finishes reading the will. The silence on the other end was immediate. What does that mean? Eric asked. You'll understand at 11. Then Linda ended the call. I stared at her. You knew Harold changed his will. She folded her napkin, buying herself time. I knew he was making changes. And you didn't tell me. He made me promise. That answer hurt more than I expected. Linda and I had been married 12 years. I was 67, retired from teaching American history at Franklin Heights High School. We weren't people who kept secrets. Our life was built around dependable things: Sunday service at St. Mark's, Wednesday meatloaf at the diner on Broad Street, and coffee on the back porch whenever Ohio weather allowed it. Harold Collins was Eric's biological father and Linda's first husband. For most of my marriage, he had been more familiar to me than he was to his own son. 5 years earlier, Harold had suffered a stroke. Eric was in Florida at a golf resort and said he couldn't get away. So I drove Harold to physical therapy every Tuesday. Later, I repaired his porch rail, changed the furnace filter, and sat with him through long afternoons when conversation came slowly. I never considered it a sacrifice. Harold was lonely, proud, and terrible at asking for help. I understood all three. My phone buzzed again. A text from Eric appeared. 11 Hulger a.m., Brooks and Mercer Law, downtown Cincinnati. Don't be late. Linda read it over my shoulder. We should leave by 9, she said. I looked at my cold eggs, then back at her. What exactly did Harold change? She stood and carried her plate to the sink. Jack, he believed you'd refuse it if you knew. Refuse what? She turned off the faucet and faced me. Everything he thought mattered. I almost laughed, but there was nothing humorous in her expression. On the drive south, the sky hung low and gray over Interstate 71. Linda kept her hands folded over her purse. Near Wilmington, she finally spoke. Whatever happens today, remember, this wasn't about money to Harold. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Daniel Brooks. Mr. Morrison, the attorney, said, when you arrive, come directly upstairs. Mr. Collins left a sealed letter that can only be opened in your presence. I glanced at Linda. She looked out the window. That was when I realized Eric wasn't the only person walking into that office with the wrong idea. Brooks and Mercer occupied the third floor of an old brick building overlooking Fountain Square in downtown Cincinnati. Linda and I arrived 15 minutes early, but Eric and Rachel were already there. Rachel stood by the reception desk, scrolling through her phone, wearing a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than my first car. Eric had a leather folder tucked under his arm and the confident smile of someone who thought the day was already over. He barely looked at me. I'm glad you made it, he said. This shouldn't take long. Linda didn't answer. Neither did I. Attorney Daniel Brooks stepped into the waiting room exactly at 11. Good morning, everyone. Please come with me. His office was simple: a long walnut conference table, family photographs on one wall, law books lined another. There wasn't anything flashy about it, which somehow made me trust him more. Once we were seated, Brooks folded his hands. Before we begin, I'd like to express my condolences. Harold Collins was my client for over 30 years. Eric nodded impatiently. We appreciate that. Can we get started? The attorney gave him a polite smile. We will. He opened a thick folder. As he arranged several documents, my mind drifted back 5 years to the day Harold called me after his stroke. Jack, he'd said, his speech still slow, any chance you could drive me to therapy Tuesday? That first drive turned into dozens. Every Tuesday morning, I'd leave Columbus before sunrise, stop at a Speedway for 2 coffees, and meet Harold outside his farmhouse near Milford. After therapy, we'd usually eat breakfast at Bob Evans. He always insisted on paying. One morning I joked, Harold, if you keep buying breakfast, I'm going to start ordering steak. He laughed. You've earned worse than pancakes. That was Harold. Never dramatic, never sentimental, just quietly grateful. When winter came, I shoveled his driveway after a snowstorm without telling him. Another time, his water heater quit on a Sunday afternoon. I spent half the day helping a plumber replace it. None of it felt extraordinary. He was 83. I had the time. That's what neighbors did. Or at least that's how I'd always been raised. Across the conference table, Brooks continued organizing papers. Eric checked his watch. Rachel leaned over and whispered, "I hope the lake house isn't a headache to sell." I don't think she realized I could hear her. Linda heard it too. She closed her eyes for just a second. Brooks finally looked up. Mr. Collins updated his estate several times during the past 5 years. Eric smiled. I figured as much. The attorney didn't react. Instead, he slid one document aside and picked up another. Before I read the will, there's something I'd like everyone to understand. He looked directly at Eric. Your father spoke often about the difference between relatives and family. The room grew noticeably quieter. Brooks continued. He believed the two weren't always the same. Eric's smile faded just enough for me to notice. Then the attorney reached into the folder one more time. He removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Jack Morrison. My stomach tightened. I've never seen that before, I said quietly. Brooks nodded. You weren't supposed to. Eric leaned forward. What's in it? The attorney rested the envelope on the table but didn't touch the seal. I was given very specific instructions. He looked around the room. This letter is to be opened only if Jack Morrison is present. Rachel frowned. That's ridiculous. Eric's voice sharpened. Open the will first. Brooks calmly shook his head. I'm afraid I can't. Then he picked up a letter opener. This, he said, is exactly where Harold wanted us to begin. Daniel Brooks slipped the letter opener beneath the envelope with the same care a surgeon might use before making the first incision. No one spoke. Even Rachel stopped tapping her fingernails on the table. Brooks unfolded 2 handwritten pages and adjusted his glasses. This isn't the will, he said. It's a personal letter. Harold instructed me to read it aloud before anything else. He looked at me. Jack, this begins with your name. I swallowed hard. Jack. Brooks read, if you're hearing this, it means I'm finally too stubborn to keep anyone waiting any longer. A faint smile crossed my face despite everything. That sounded exactly like Harold. You spent 5 years insisting you weren't doing anything special. Every Tuesday you drove nearly 2 hours to take an old man to therapy. You fixed things I never asked you to fix. You sat with me on Thanksgiving when everyone else was busy. You listened when I talked about your wife baseball history and the mistakes I'd made. The room remained perfectly still. You never once asked what I'd leave behind. You only asked how I was feeling. I lowered my eyes. I remembered those Tuesdays, stopping at Speedway before sunrise, bringing Harold his favorite black coffee, arguing about whether the Reds would ever have another championship season. None of it had felt remarkable. It was just friendship. Brooks continued reading. Jack, I watched you treat me with more respect than my own family did. That's a painful sentence to write, but it's the truth. Rachel crossed her arms. Eric stared at the table. People think inheritance is about money. They're wrong. It's about trust, and trust is earned one ordinary day at a time. I heard Linda quietly sniff beside me. Brooks paused before reading the next paragraph. To my son Eric, Eric finally looked up. I loved you from the day you were born and I never stopped. But love cannot erase disappointment. I don't blame you for building a successful career. I blame you for believing success excused your absence. Eric shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's not fair, he muttered. Brooks didn't respond. He simply kept reading. There were birthdays you missed, surgeries you never visited, Christmas dinners canceled because business came first. I always made excuses for you because fathers do that. Eventually, I ran out of excuses. Rachel leaned toward Eric. You don't have to listen to this. Actually, Brooks said calmly, Mr. Collins specifically instructed that everyone remain until the letter's finished. Rachel sat back without another word. Jack never replaced you, the letter continued. That wasn't possible, but he reminded me what kindness looks like when no one's keeping score. I rubbed my forehead. This wasn't comfortable. I hadn't helped Harold to be praised. If anything, hearing those words made me wish we were somewhere else. Brooks folded the second page closed. There's one final sentence. He looked directly at me before reading it. Blood made us relatives. Character showed me who my family truly was. The room fell silent again. This time, no one rushed to fill it. Finally, Eric pushed his chair back. So that's it, he said sharply. A guilt trip. Brooks calmly placed the letter beside the folder. No. He reached for another thick document. That was only Harold's introduction. Eric frowned. What do you mean? The attorney opened a blue binder. What comes next, he said, is Mr. Collins' final will and testament. For the first time since we'd arrived, I had the unmistakable feeling that none of us, not even Linda, fully understood what Harold had planned. Daniel Brooks adjusted the blue binder in front of him and looked around the table. This document was signed 6 months ago, he said. It legally replaced every previous version of Mr. Collins' estate plan. Eric folded his arms. Good, he said, and let's get to it. Brooks gave a slight nod and began reading. The first few pages covered ordinary legal language debts, taxes, funeral expenses. Then came several personal gifts. Harold's vintage pocket watch went to the Cincinnati Historical Society. His collection of military books was donated to the local library. His antique woodworking tools would remain with the farmhouse. Rachel sighed impatiently. When do we get to the important part? Brooks ignored the interruption. I'll get there in due time. He turned another page. I leave my lake cabin in Brown County to be sold. The proceeds will become part of the Harold and Margaret Collins Community Trust. Eric frowned. Wait, sold? Yes. Rachel looked confused. I thought we were keeping that. Brooks continued reading without looking up. I also direct that my investment account's certificates of deposit and rental properties be liquidated and transferred into the trust. Eric leaned forward. What trust? The one established under this will. His voice remained calm. The trust's purpose is to provide financial assistance for elderly residents who wish to remain in their own homes rather than enter assisted living facilities. No one spoke. I remembered Harold mentioning once how frightened he was of losing his independence. He'd said it over breakfast one snowy morning. I don't mind getting old, he told me. I just don't want to stop feeling like I'm home. Back then, I hadn't realized he was already thinking about his legacy. Brooks reached the next section. Mr. Collins appointed a trustee to oversee all operations. Eric smiled again. I assume that's me. The attorney finally looked directly at him. No? The room seemed to shrink. The sole trustee is... He glanced at the page. Jack Morrison. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard. What? Brooks repeated it. You, Mr. Morrison? I immediately shook my head. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. I've never managed anything like that. Mr. Collins addressed that concern. Brooks picked up another sheet. Jack will probably try to refuse this job, he read. A nervous laugh escaped me. That sounds like him. Tell him I'm not asking because he knows finance. I'm asking because he knows people. I felt my throat tighten. Brooks continued. Money can always be counted. Character can't. Across the table, Eric's face had turned bright red. This is unbelievable. Rachel slammed her hand onto the table. He manipulated an old man. No, Linda said quietly. He loved his father. Rachel looked at her. You actually believe this? Linda didn't raise her voice. I know exactly why Harold made this decision. Brooks waited until the room settled. Mr. Collins also left Mr. Morrison ownership of the farmhouse, the 1966 Chevrolet pickup, his woodworking shop, and all personal journals. I stared at him. I don't want his house. It isn't about the house, Linda whispered. I finally understood. Harold hadn't been trying to reward me. He'd been trying to protect something he believed in. Eric suddenly stood so fast his chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. This isn't over. His voice echoed through the office. I'm hiring my own attorney. Brooks calmly closed the binder. That is, of course, your legal right. Eric pointed at me. You think you've won? I met his eyes for the first time all morning. I never came here trying to win. He gave a bitter laugh. We'll see about that. He turned and walked out. Rachel hurried after him without saying goodbye. The office door slammed behind them. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Brooks slowly gathered the papers. I'm afraid, he said, this is only the beginning. Eric didn't make it all the way to the elevator. We heard his footsteps stop in the hallway, followed by muffled voices. A minute later, the office door opened again. He walked back in, still angry, but this time trying harder to stay composed. I'd like to hear the rest, he said. Daniel Brooks nodded. That's probably a good idea. Eric sat down without looking at me. Rachel remained standing for a moment before reluctantly taking her seat. Brooks reopened the binder. There is one final section regarding Mr. Collins' estate. Eric crossed his arms. Let's hear it. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The Harold and Margaret Collins Community Trust will receive approximately $4.2 million after taxes and liquidation of assets. Rachel's eyes widened. $4 million, Brooks continued. The trust is legally restricted. The money cannot be distributed to family members under any circumstance. Eric looked stunned. So none of us inherit it? Correct. What about me? You do receive an inheritance. Eric leaned forward. Finally, this was the part he'd been waiting for. Brooks read directly from the will. Mr. Eric Collins shall receive $100,000. Rachel immediately whispered, That's it. Brooks raised a hand. There is one condition. The room fell quiet again. Before those funds may be released, Mr. Collins must complete 100 documented volunteer hours assisting senior citizens through a nonprofit organization approved by the trustee. Eric blinked. You've got to be kidding. I'm afraid not. Rachel laughed in disbelief. So he has to earn his own inheritance. Brooks answered calmly. Your father believes service teaches lessons money cannot. Eric pushed the chair back a few inches. This is insane. No, Linda said quietly. It's exactly something your father would do. Eric turned toward her. You're taking his side. I'm taking the side of the man who spent years hoping you'd visit. The words hung in the room. For a moment, nobody spoke. Brooks continued reading. If Mr. Collins chooses not to complete the volunteer hours within 2 years, those funds shall automatically become part of the trust. Eric rubbed both hands across his face. So either I volunteer or I lose it. That is correct. He laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. It sounded more like someone trying to convince himself none of this mattered. Then Brooks turned to me. Mr. Morrison, there is one additional responsibility. I looked up. The farmhouse is to remain in the trust for at least 10 years. It will serve as the organization's headquarters. So, I can't sell it. No. And the truck? That belongs to you personally. I nodded slowly. To my surprise, I wasn't disappointed. The house had never felt like mine anyway. What unsettled me was everything else. Managing a $4 million charitable trust. I'd spent 35 years teaching teenagers about the Civil War and the Constitution. I barely knew how to read investment reports. I don't think I'm the right person, I admitted. Brooks smiled. I said the same thing to Harold. What did he say? The attorney chuckled. He said that's exactly why Jack is the right person. For the first time that morning, Linda reached over and squeezed my hand. You won't be doing it alone. I looked at her. You knew about the trust. I knew he wanted to help lonely seniors. But not this, she shook her head. Not all of it. Across the room, Eric stood again. This time there was no shouting, no threats, just disappointment mixed with wounded pride. As he walked toward the door, he stopped beside me. Without looking me in the eye, he said quietly, This isn't finished, Jack. Then he left. Rachel hurried after him. The office grew silent once more. Brooks closed the binder. I should probably warn you, he said. I've handled enough estate disputes to know what comes next. I frowned. What do you mean? He folded his hands. If I know Eric, he paused. By tomorrow morning, half the family will believe you manipulated Harold into rewriting his will. I felt my stomach sink. The inheritance wasn't the beginning of my reward. It was the beginning of the hardest fight I'd faced since retiring. Daniel Brooks turned out to be right. By the time Linda and I pulled into our driveway in Columbus that evening, my phone already held 6 missed calls. None of them were congratulations. 3 came from cousins I'd barely spoken to in years. One was from an old church friend, another from Harold's neighbor. The last was from a number I didn't recognize. I listened to the first voicemail while Linda unpacked the leftovers we'd picked up on the drive home. Jack, while my cousin Steve said, I don't know what happened down there, but people are saying you talked Harold into cutting Eric out. Tell me that isn't true. I deleted the message without answering. Then another text appeared. You should be ashamed. No name, just the words. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Linda looked over. It started. I guess so. She walked over and rested a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone. I know, but that was easier said than done. For the first time since Harold and I had become friends, I found myself wondering whether I'd done something wrong simply by caring about him. The next morning I drove to the farmhouse alone. It sat just outside Milford, surrounded by old maple trees Harold had planted decades ago. The porch swing creaked in the breeze exactly the way it always had. His old red pickup was still parked beside the barn. Seeing it there nearly broke me. I unlocked the front door with the key Brooks had handed me. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and black coffee. Nothing had moved. His reading glasses still rested beside the recliner. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the end table. For a moment, I simply stood there. The house felt less like property and more like someone waiting to come home. While looking through the kitchen drawers for spare keys, I noticed a stack of spiral notebooks tied together with a leather strap. Harold's journals. I carried them to the dining room table. The first notebook opened to an entry dated almost 4 years earlier. Jack replaced the porch light today. I offered him money. He laughed and asked if I had any pie instead. I smiled. I remembered that pie. Apple. A little too much cinnamon? The next page read, He thinks he's helping an old man. He doesn't understand he's giving me back my dignity. I stopped reading. Those words hit harder than anything Harold's letter had said. He'd noticed everything, even the things I thought were too small to matter. Around noon, there was a knock at the front door. It was Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm. She held a covered casserole dish. "I figured you probably hadn't eaten," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she smiled gently. "But Harold would have fussed at me if I didn't." As we stood on the porch talking, another pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Then another. By 2 o'clock, half a dozen neighbors had stopped by. One offered to mow the grass. Another brought fresh tomatoes from his garden. An elderly couple asked whether the trust would still help local seniors. Nobody asked about the money. Nobody accused me of anything. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was Eric. I let it ring. A minute later, another message appeared. "Hope you're enjoying my father's house." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Part of me wanted to answer, to defend myself, to remind him that I'd never asked Harold for a single thing. Instead, I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Standing there on Harold's porch, surrounded by people whose lives he'd quietly touched, I finally understood something. Winning a legal battle wasn't going to be enough. If I wanted to protect Harold's final wish, I'd have to protect his reputation too. And that fight was only beginning. 3 days later, I got a call from someone I didn't know. "Mr. Morrison." "Speaking. My name is Kelly Sanders. I'm a reporter with the Cincinnati Enquirer. Do you have a few minutes?" My first instinct was to say no. I wasn't interested in publicity. I had spent 35 years standing in front of classrooms, and retirement had taught me how much I enjoyed living quietly. "I'm not sure there's much to tell," I said. "There is," Kelly replied. "I've spoken with your attorney, several of Harold Collins' neighbors, and volunteers from Mercy Health. They all told me the same thing." "What was that?" "They said if anyone understands why Harold made those decisions, it's you." I glanced around the farmhouse kitchen. The coffee pot was brewing. Outside, the grass I'd promised Harold I'd mow every Saturday was getting a little too tall again. "This isn't about me," I said. "I know," Kelly answered. "That's exactly why I'd like to hear your side." The interview lasted less than an hour. I never mentioned Eric, never criticized Rachel. I simply talked about Harold. I told her about Tuesday mornings at physical therapy, about our breakfasts at Bob Evans, about the time we spent nearly an entire afternoon trying and failing to fix his old riding mower, before finally laughing ourselves silly and calling a mechanic. "He was stubborn," I said, "but he was funny." Kelly smiled. "What do you think he wanted people to remember?" I didn't have to think very long. That getting older doesn't mean you stop needing people. The article appeared that Sunday. The headline read, "Retired Teacher Honors Friend's Final Wish to Help Seniors Stay Home." There wasn't a single sentence about lawsuits, nothing about money. Instead, the story focused on Harold's dream of helping older folks stay in the homes they loved. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing again. This time, the messages sounded very different. A retired carpenter offered to volunteer. A local hardware store donated paint and lumber. A church in Milford called to ask how they could help repair homes for elderly residents. Then Brooks called. "I thought you'd like to know something." "What?" "3 families have already made donations to the trust." I smiled. Harold would have liked that. He would have. Not everyone was happy. Eric certainly wasn't. Late that afternoon, Linda looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Have you seen Facebook today?" "I try not to." She turned the tablet toward me. Eric had posted a long message accusing me of manipulating his father. Hundreds of people had commented. But instead of agreeing with him, former nurses, neighbors, Harold's physical therapist, even the cashier from the Kroger where Harold shopped every Friday, one after another they shared stories about seeing me drive Harold to appointments, carry groceries, or sit beside him in waiting rooms. No one argued. They simply told the truth. Eric's post disappeared before dinner. Around 7 that evening, my phone buzzed. His name appeared on the screen. For a long moment, I just looked at it. Linda reached over and squeezed my hand. "You don't have to answer." I nodded. "I know." The phone stopped ringing. A second later, a voicemail notification appeared. I pressed play. "Jack?" His voice sounded different, quieter. "I think we need to talk." He paused. "If you're willing, I'd like to meet. Just the two of us." I stared out toward the porch where Harold and I had spent so many evenings watching the sunset. Maybe this was another argument waiting to happen. Or maybe it was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. We agreed to meet 2 days later at a small diner just outside Wilmington, halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati. It was one of those places that had been around forever. Vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, a waitress who called everyone Hon. The lunch crowd had thinned out by the time I arrived. Eric was already there. He looked different, not older, just tired. The sharp confidence he'd carried into the lawyer's office was gone. As I slid into the booth, neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, he pushed a coffee mug toward me. I already ordered one for you. I gave him a small nod. Thanks. The waitress topped off both cups and walked away. Eric stared out the window before speaking. I read the article. I figured. I also read the comments. I didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. He rubbed his hands together. I always thought people would take my side. They weren't choosing sides. I know that now. His voice cracked ever so slightly. They were telling the truth. For the first time since I'd known him, Eric wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to understand one. After a long silence, he asked the question I never expected. Did my dad ever talk about me? I looked down at my coffee. Every week. His eyes lifted immediately. He did almost every Tuesday. What did he say? I smiled sadly. He wanted to know if you were healthy. Eric blinked. That's all. He asked if work was going well. He looked away. And he wondered if your back ever got better after that skiing accident. Eric frowned. I never even told him about that. No, I smiled gently. He heard it from your mother. Eric covered his face with one hand. I thought he hated me. He didn't. He should have. The words came out barely above a whisper. I missed birthdays. I know. I skipped surgeries. I know. I kept telling myself I'd visit next month. He laughed bitterly. Then next month became next year. Neither of us touched our lunch after it arrived. The food sat there getting cold. I was scared, he admitted. Of what? Watching him get old. I looked at him. When I was a kid, he could fix anything. His voice shook. Then one day he needed help walking. He swallowed hard. I didn't know how to deal with that. So you stayed away. He nodded. It was easier. I reached into the canvas bag I'd brought with me. I have something. I laid one of Harold's journals on the table. Eric stared at it. He wanted you to have this. No, I do. He slowly opened the cover. Several minutes passed as he silently turned pages. I watched his expression change. Confusion. Surprise. Regret. Then tears. He stopped on one page and read aloud. Eric called today. We only talked 3 minutes, but hearing his voice made my whole week. He flipped another page. I hope someday he understands that he never had to impress me. I only wanted more time with my son. Eric closed the notebook. His shoulders began to shake. I wasted so much time. I didn't disagree. There wasn't any kindness in pretending otherwise. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. Do you think, he began before stopping. I waited. Do you think my dad ever forgave me? I thought about Harold sitting on his porch watching the sunset, about all those Tuesday mornings, about the way he always smiled whenever Eric's name came up. Then I answered honestly. I don't think he ever stopped loving you. Eric lowered his head. For the first time, I realized this wasn't the beginning of my revenge. It was the beginning of his. He would spend the rest of his life remembering every visit he never made. And no court could ever hand down a harsher sentence than that. A week after our conversation at the diner, Eric called again. This time, there wasn't any hesitation in his voice. I'd like to help at the farmhouse, he said. I leaned back in my porch chair and looked across Harold's property. The fence along the north pasture had started leaning after years of Ohio winters. You know it'll be work. I know. And it won't change the will. I know that too. Saturday morning, he pulled into the driveway wearing old jeans and work boots I'd never seen him wear before. Rachel climbed out of the passenger seat, carrying a tray of coffee and a paper bag from a local bakery. I figured we'd all need breakfast, she said awkwardly. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The three of us spent the morning replacing fence posts. Eric wasn't very good with a post hole digger. I spend too much time behind a desk, he admitted after the second hole. I laughed. That much is obvious. For the first time, he laughed too. It felt strange. Natural, but strange. Around noon, Linda arrived with sandwiches she'd made at home. The four of us sat beneath the old maple tree Harold had planted nearly 40 years earlier. No one talked about lawyers or inheritance. We talked about baseball, the weather, how terrible Cincinnati traffic had become. It was the first peaceful meal we'd shared in years. After lunch, Rachel volunteered to organize the boxes stored in the upstairs bedrooms. An hour later, she called down. Jack, could you come up here? I climbed the narrow staircase. She was sitting on the floor beside an old cedar chest. In her lap rested a bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. I think these are for Eric. She handed me the top envelope. It had never been mailed. The handwriting was Harold's. I carried the bundle downstairs. Eric looked confused. What are those? They're from your dad. He untied the ribbon. The first letter began, I almost called today, but I didn't want to interrupt your meeting. Another started, I saw a father teaching his son to fish this morning. It reminded me of you when you were 8. There were dozens. None had ever been sent. Eric quietly read one after another. By the time he reached the last page, tears rolled freely down his face. I never knew. No, Linda said softly. You never gave him the chance. She wasn't cruel, just honest. Eric nodded. I know. He folded the letters carefully and placed them back inside the ribbon. I'm keeping these. I think Harold would have wanted that, I said. Over the next several weeks, things slowly changed. Not overnight. Real life rarely works that way. Eric completed his volunteer hours at a senior center in Cincinnati. Then he kept going after the required hours were finished. Rachel began organizing neighborhood fundraisers for the trust. The hardware store donated building supplies. A retired electrician offered free labor. Before long, we repaired our first home, a small white bungalow owned by an 82-year-old widow named Martha. When she stood on her new front porch and thanked everyone with tears in her eyes, I glanced toward Eric. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He wasn't checking his phone. He was simply smiling, a quiet, genuine smile. Driving home that evening, Linda reached across the truck and took my hand. You know, she said, Harold would have loved seeing today. I smiled. I think he did. The sun was beginning to set behind the Ohio fields. For the first time since that terrible phone call at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning, I realized Harold hadn't left us a fortune. He'd left us something far more difficult, a chance to become the people we should have been all along. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The maple trees around Harold's farmhouse turned shades of gold and deep red, and every Saturday morning the porch filled with people carrying toolboxes instead of briefcases. What had once been one lonely man's home had become the headquarters of the Harold and Margaret Collins Community Trust. The old workshop buzzed with volunteers repairing walkers, building wheelchair ramps, and cutting lumber for the next project. Sometimes I'd stand back with a cup of coffee and simply watch. It still didn't feel like my accomplishment. It felt like Harold's final conversation with the world. One Saturday afternoon, we gathered outside the farmhouse to dedicate a small wooden sign. More than 100 people came. Neighbors, church members, teachers I'd worked with years before, families whose homes had already been repaired. Even Martha the widow, whose porch had become our first project, insisted on bringing 2 homemade apple pies. Daniel Brooks stood beside me. I've handled estate cases for over 30 years, he said quietly. I've never seen one end quite like this. Neither have I. He smiled. Most people fight over money. We almost did. But Harold found another way. When it came time for speeches, I expected Brooks to go first. Instead, he handed the microphone to Eric. The crowd grew still. Eric looked nervous. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit anymore. Just blue jeans, a flannel shirt, and the same work boots he'd worn while repairing fences. He cleared his throat. When my father passed away, he began, I thought someone had stolen my inheritance. He paused. I was wrong. The crowd listened quietly. I thought success meant having more than everyone else. He looked over at me, but Jack showed me something my father had been trying to teach me for years. He took a slow breath. The greatest inheritance my dad left me wasn't money. It was the chance to become a better son. Even if I had to learn that lesson too late. A few people wiped away tears, including me. Eric stepped away from the microphone and walked toward me. Without saying a word, he held out his hand. I looked at it for a second. Then I stood and pulled him into a hug. The applause that followed wasn't loud because people enjoyed watching someone lose. It was loud because they had just watched someone choose humility. That felt far more satisfying than revenge ever could. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Every Tuesday I still drove to the farmhouse. Old habits are hard to break. Only now, instead of taking Harold to therapy, I unlocked the workshop and welcomed volunteers. Eric never missed a Saturday. Rachel became one of the Trust's best organizers, somehow convincing local businesses to donate supplies almost every month. Linda often joked that retirement had become busier than our working years. She wasn't wrong. One evening, as we sat together on Harold's old porch swing, watching the sun disappear beyond the fields, she rested her head on my shoulder. He'd be smiling right now. I think so too. The rocking chair beside us sat empty, but somehow, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. Looking back, I realized revenge isn't always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about refusing to become bitter while the truth slowly finds its own voice. Eric lost something far more valuable than money the day his father died. He lost the chance to make more memories. The rest of us simply chose not to waste the time we still had. If this story reminds you of someone who's quietly been there for you, a parent, a neighbor, a friend, don't wait for a funeral to tell them what they mean to you. And if this journey touched your heart, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need the same reminder. Sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't what we own, it's how we treat the people who are still here. The end.